All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Going deep into the book of Job today,
Ah, Job.
specifically chapters 22 to 24,
All right.
where Job's friend Eliphaz is really trying to figure out why Job is suffering so much.
Yeah, the big questions.
Yeah, so get ready to explore some pretty heavy themes: justice, suffering, and the age-old question of why bad things happen to good people.
Yeah, these chapters really get to the heart of the human struggle to understand, all that pain and suffering. It's a theme that never gets old, really.
No, it doesn't. And Eliphaz really doesn't hold back, does he? He pretty much flat out says that Job's suffering is a direct consequence of his own actions.
He does. He really does. It's almost as if he's looking at Job and thinking, well, there's got to be a reason for this. You must have done something to deserve all this pain.
And it's such a common reaction, isn't it? Like when we see someone going through something really awful, it's almost natural to wonder what they might have done to bring it on themselves.
Totally. It's that part of us that just wants to believe that the world is fair and predictable. If we can pinpoint a cause for the suffering, it makes the world seem a little less random, a little less scary.
So can you break down some of the specific things Eliphaz accuses Job of? What exactly did he think Job did wrong?
Well, he starts off by insinuating that Job took advantage of those who were less fortunate than him. Taking pledges from his brothers, stripping people of their clothing, maybe as collateral for debts, things like that, and even denying the basic necessities like food and water to those in need.
Wow, he's painting a picture of Job as quite a ruthless guy. It's like he's trying to make Job's suffering fit this nice little box of cause and effect.
Exactly. It's as if he's saying, see, all this pain that you're going through, it's proof that you've strayed from the path. The universe demands balance, you see, and this is simply the scales tipping back to restore that balance.
It's interesting that he specifically calls out actions that targeted the most vulnerable in society. Widows, orphans, the poor.
Absolutely. It's as if he's suggesting that by hurting those who couldn't fight back, Job broke some sort of universal moral law, and now this suffering is his punishment.
But how does Job take all this? Does he accept Eliphaz's judgment?
Not a chance. In chapter 23, we see Job passionately defending his innocence. He doesn't deny that these sorts of injustices happen in the world, but he's adamant that he is not guilty of them. What he really yearns for is a chance to speak directly with God, to plead his case and understand why he's enduring this pain.
So instead of just accepting his fate passively, he's seeking answers, he's fighting back.
Right. It's as if he's wrestling with his faith while simultaneously being crushed by this unimaginable pain.
A struggle that I think we can all relate to on some level, right? Wanting to make sense of suffering and to find meaning in the midst of chaos. I think we all want to believe that there's a reason for the pain
Absolutely.
and that it's not just random and pointless.
Yeah, totally. But then, in chapter 24, Job takes a sharp turn. He shifts away from his own personal struggle and starts observing the world around him. What's he looking at now? Well, he begins describing all the different kinds of injustice that are happening all around him. People moving landmarks, essentially stealing land. Theft of flocks, which back then would have been devastating for people's livelihoods. Oppressing widows and orphans, denying them justice and exploiting them, leaving them with nothing.
It's like he's holding up a mirror to society, showing us how those in power often take advantage of the vulnerable. And he seems to be connecting these injustices to his own suffering.
He is. It's as if he's questioning God's role in all of this, asking, if you're truly a just and compassionate God, then why do you let these things happen? Why don't you step in and protect the innocent?
That's a pretty bold question, especially when you consider how much he's already suffering.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's saying, hey, I might be going through hell right now, but I'm not the only one who's hurting. There's something much bigger at play here.
Yes. And it really makes us confront the tension between what we believe about a just God and the often harsh realities of the world we live in.
It's a real philosophical dilemma, isn't it?
Yeah.
If bad things can happen to good people, even someone as righteous as Job claims to be, then what does that say about the nature of justice and God's role in our lives?
Yeah.
Makes you think.
It really does. Yeah. It really throws a wrench in that idea that you just reap what you sow. Like if Job is really innocent, like he says he is, then his suffering doesn't really fit that simple cause and effect model.
It's like he's saying there's a crack in the foundation of that whole belief system. Like if suffering isn't always a direct result of our actions, then what is it? And where does that leave our understanding of God and his justice?
Right. It raises the question of whether maybe suffering serves some other purpose, or if it's just part of, the unpredictable nature of existence. And if God really is in control, how does that line up with, how randomly pain and hardship seem to be dealt out.
It's definitely a question that's been debated for centuries in theology, and I think it's something we still struggle with today. Like, you see people going through terrible loss or hardship, and it's hard to square that with the idea of a God who is both loving and all-powerful.
It really is, and that tension is what makes Job's story so compelling. It doesn't shy away from those tough questions. It acknowledges that there's messiness and mystery.
And it kind of gives us permission to ask those questions ourselves,
Right.
to grapple with doubt and uncertainty, and just admit that sometimes there are no easy answers.
Exactly. Faith isn't about blind acceptance. It's about engaging in that struggle, wrestling with those hard questions and coming to our own understanding of what we believe.
So let's go back to those specific accusations that Eliphaz brings up in chapter 22. He doesn't just say that Job messed up in some vague way. He gets into a lot of detail. Why do you think he does that?
I think it serves a few purposes. On one hand, it gives Eliphaz a way to explain Job's suffering. It allows him to hold on to his belief in a just world where people ultimately get what they deserve.
It's like he's trying to convince himself as much as he's trying to convince Job.
Right. But there's also, I think, a deeper psychological thing going on, by zeroing in on these very specific sins, especially the ones that involve taking advantage of the weak. Eliphaz is tapping into a shared sense of what's right and wrong.
It's like he's saying, even if you don't think you did anything wrong, surely you can agree that these things deserve punishment.
Exactly. He's appealing to their shared understanding of justice, trying to get Job to see his suffering as the natural result of breaking some kind of universal moral code.
And there's a certain power in that kind of argument, even if we don't totally buy into the idea that suffering is always punishment.
Right.
I think a part of us wants to believe that the world works that way.
Absolutely. It goes back to that longing for order and predictability that we talked about. If we can believe that bad things only happen to bad people, then it makes us feel safe. Like maybe we can avoid suffering if we just do the right things.
But then Job comes along and throws a wrench in that whole system. He's so insistent that he's innocent. And then he starts pointing out all these other instances of injustice in the world. It's like he's saying, hey, look, the bad guys don't always get what's coming to them, and the good guys don't always get rewarded. The world is a lot messier than that.
And that's where things get really interesting. He's forcing us to confront that messiness, that ambiguity. Yep. He's pushing us to grapple with the question of why suffering exists, even when there doesn't seem to be a clear explanation or a good reason for it.
So let's dive into some of those specific injustices that Job describes in chapter 24.
Yeah.
He paints a pretty grim picture, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about things like people moving landmarks to steal land from their neighbors, stealing livestock, which would have been a huge blow to those who depended on them for survival, oppressing widows and orphans, denying them justice, exploiting their work, leaving them with absolutely nothing.
It's like he's really shining a light on how those with power can so easily exploit those who are vulnerable. Like, he's saying that even in a society that has laws and rules, there's still this undercurrent of injustice.
And it doesn't stop there. He even brings up things like murder and adultery. Like, he's saying that even the most blatant violations of morality and social norms often go unpunished.
So how does all this relate back to his own situation? Is he just making a general statement about the way the world works, or is there a deeper point that he's trying to get across?
I think he's doing both. On the one hand, he's highlighting how common injustice is, but he's also using it as a way to challenge Eliphaz's very neat and tidy explanation for his own suffering. It's almost like he's saying, look, bad things happen to all sorts of people, regardless of whether they deserve it or not, so why should I be any different?
It's like he's dismantling the whole framework that Eliphaz built to try and make sense of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying that explanation doesn't hold water when you look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. He's forcing Eliphaz, and really all of us listening, to consider that there may not be a simple explanation for suffering, that sometimes it just is, and maybe that's all right.
It's a pretty radical idea, especially back then when people were so focused on finding a reason for everything, a justification for every bit of bad luck.
It is, and that's a big part of what makes the book of Job so challenging and so relevant even today. It doesn't give us easy answers. It doesn't try to simplify the messiness of life. It just presents us with this question. What do we do with suffering when we can't make sense of it?
And it's a question that requires real intellectual and emotional honesty.
Absolutely.
And it's one that I think we're going to keep exploring for the rest of this deep dive. Job's really pushing the envelope here.
Yeah.
He's not just questioning his own suffering. He's challenging that whole system of belief that people use to explain why good and bad things happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like he's saying, if your theory about suffering is right, then explain all these other cases where it doesn't fit, where bad people are doing well and good people are getting crushed.
It's a really compelling argument, and it gets to the core of this question that's been bothering theologians and philosophers for centuries, right?
Hmm.
If God is all-powerful and all-loving, then why is there so much suffering in the world?
Exactly. And the book of Job doesn't shy away from it at all. It gives us these two very different viewpoints. You've got Eliphaz, who represents the traditional idea that suffering is a consequence of sin. And then you've got Job, who challenges that idea and demands a more satisfying explanation.
And it's worth pointing out that Job isn't just sitting back and watching these injustices happen. He's actively speaking out against them. It's as if he's appealing to a higher power, even while he's questioning its sense of justice.
There's a real rawness to his words. It's not just a theological debate. He's pouring out his grief and anger and confusion. He's demanding to know why the world is the way it is.
And that's a big part of what makes this book so relatable, even all these years later. We've all felt that sense of unfairness, that feeling that things just aren't right.
Yeah.
We've all asked those why questions.
We have, and I think that's why the book of Job still resonates with people today. It doesn't try to give us simple answers or easy solutions. It acknowledges how complex the human experience is, the reality of suffering and the struggle to reconcile that with what we believe.
It's like Job's giving us permission to question, to doubt, to wrestle with those hard questions, and maybe even find a stronger, more authentic faith in the process.
I think you're exactly right. Faith isn't about blind acceptance or simplistic answers. It's about going through that struggle, even when it's painful. It's about searching for truth, even when it seems impossible to find.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these chapters, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to take away? What do you hope they'll remember?
I hope it encourages them to really embrace the complexity of the questions Job raises, to not run away from the parts of faith that are hard, but to lean into them, to wrestle with those doubts and uncertainties, and realize that real growth often happens in the midst of that struggle.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most meaningful answers come from asking the right questions. And even when we're faced with terrible suffering, there's still room for hope, for questioning, and for a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
I think you put that beautifully. And it's worth remembering that even though Job's story is filled with so much pain and loss, it doesn't end in despair. There's a sense of resilience and hope that comes through even in the darkest moments.
It's a powerful message that even when we're grappling with these huge existential questions, there's still that something inside us that keeps searching, keeps hoping, keeps believing that there's more to the story.
There is, and I think that's what makes the book of Job such a timeless and enduring testament to the human spirit.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the book of Job. We hope this encourages you to continue thinking about these questions and to explore all the layers of meaning woven into this ancient and incredibly powerful text.
Welcome to Charlie and Mia's podcast. We're embarking on an exciting journey to read through the entire Bible in just 1 year. Every day, we dive into Scripture, exploring its meanings and how it applies to our lives today. We invite you to join us on this incredible adventure of learning and discovery. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode.